Elliot, welcome back. A lot has happened since last time we talked. We chatted August 2022,
Oh,
and
wow.
you were a month out from Pearl hitting theaters. I hadn't seen it yet, and it was the first time that I found out there was going to be a trilogy. So, yeah, I mean, how have the last 4 or 5 years been for you? Has it been like going to war? Has it been a dream? What's the experience been like since you rolled on X?
I mean, it's been busy. X and Pearl were like kind of unique because it was still like COVID was going on hardcore here, and we were in New Zealand. And I went back to work after returning from New Zealand. Went back to work here and did a couple more episodes of Snowfall on FX, and then did the second season of Perry Mason, and then I went pretty much straight into MaXXXine. We wrapped up just before the strikes happened last year, and then I had like 7 months off with the strikes. And then right after those ended, I've just been back to work for the last 4 or 5 months on a Amazon project called the Bondsman that Kevin Bacon is also in. So
That's interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Pure coincidence. Just happened to be involved in both.
No, I think it was him basically that got me onto the Bondsman. Like after doing MaXXXine, he was one of the producers on the Bondsman, and he recommended me for the job.
Very cool. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a good person to have recommending you for stuff.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
He's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like you've mentioned in some other interviews I've listened to, like when it comes to challenge, X was challenging due to weather, and you're shooting on a barn, and just looking at the movie, you can sense that like that's a difficult shoot. But then MaXXXine is this massive scale, like certainly the biggest in the trilogy. I have to imagine one of the larger projects that you've worked on. Like in terms of difficulty and gearing up for it, like did it feel like, hey, we're just back to same crew, we're going into this? Or was it something where it's like, okay, we've got Kevin Bacon and we're shooting on Universal backlots, and we're like, how intimidating a lift was MaXXXine going into it?
Well, I mean, it was in LA, and I had been working a lot over the last number of years in LA, like both doing Snowfall and Perry Mason. And weirdly, both those shows also were period pieces in LA. We brought on a number of crew people that I was familiar with from LA. It was all different people, obviously, from New Zealand. We didn't, and, it's sort of like any project. Like when you start to break it down with the director, it's like you realize, okay, this scene and this scene, and these are not so much of a problem. And then, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this? Like the Hollywood sign thing in MaXXXine was like, whoa. And, in Hollywood Boulevard was like these giant sort of logistical undertakings. But when you start to break it down page by page and scene by scene, and you start to try to understand, well, these are the pictures we need to make. These are the shots we're going to do. These are the resources we need to put in front of the camera. It gets more complicated, certainly when there's more of that, but it's still the same process, really. You know what I mean? In order to do it successfully, the undertaking of like what we did on Hollywood Boulevard, you start to rely on a whole lot of people, like the art department and picture cars and, all these things. And it's like you repeat yourself over and over again. It's like, the camera's going to be here. We're going to look in this direction. Like we're going to have to deal with that thing in the background, and we're going to see the cars going around that corner over there. And you just try to let everybody know. And hopefully, everybody around you is paying attention and, on the same page about it. And then it all comes together, or it doesn't,
Right. You mentioned shooting in LA, and I know a large chunk of this is shot in LA. Was there anything that was shot in New Zealand? Because I was watching the credits to scope this out to see, but it seems like, and New Zealand's mentioned, is it just because there's scenes from X shown, or was there actual shooting for MaXXXine in the production?
Everything for MaXXXine was shot in LA. Okay. And then anything that was like flashback stuff to X was just lifted out of that material that we had already shot.
Okay.
Yeah. And then like when Pearl appears in the house, in the window of the house, it was another actor in the makeup and stuff like that. So
this is obviously a third movie in a trilogy, and you've got, this visual language that's carried through all of them. Like there's shots that are very distinctly this franchise. There's even editing styles like the 3-cut flashes into different moments. But you also have 3 distinct time periods. So this question's a little bit big, I'm sure, but I'm curious, were there some visual language pieces that you carried through each movie intentionally? Like these are the rules of the X kind of trilogy. And then also, were there some things for each time period that you were like, okay, these are the rules for MaXXXine. Like this is a rule from 1980 cinema that we have to follow.
I think I said this to somebody else before. It's like my brain doesn't really work like in like that kind of like, okay, we're going to make rules and we're going to like follow these things really specifically. Like I think for me, and so other than like the motif of the opening shot being the doors opening kind of thing, I don't remember really that there was any sort of super conscious, at least for me, effort to like maintain a specific motifs, visual motifs through all 3 movies. In terms of each specific movie having its own unique feel, instead of like kind of trying to come up with a conscious set of rules, I tend to like just try to steep myself in what it is we are intending to do in the pre-production process and like, talk it out, especially with Ti. It's like we look at a lot of pictures and movies and things like that, and then go into it sort of with just this kind of fully formed aesthetic in my mind that like when I'm standing there, it becomes apparent whether or not the shot that we're doing is appropriate for the movie, because there's so many decisions you have to make every day, all day long. Like if I had to sort of filter it through some sort of conscious set of rules, I don't know that I would succeed that way. It's more like, oh, okay, here is all the reference material that we've been looking at for the last 2 months or whatever. And it's kind of all packed in there somewhere. And like, when I'm looking at this monitor and setting up this shot, does it feel like that? Or do I need to change it and make it feel like that? So it's kind of, that's more the process. It's not quite as literal, I guess, as like coming up with a set of sort of rules.
Right. Yeah. It's just having that vocabulary in your mind so you can go into it. Like, I think Ti West said something like that too. It was Variety or one of the news magazines that he was interviewing with, and he was talking about zooms, and I remember him saying like, it's not like we saw this zoom in say a De Palma movie and now we're going to do that zoom. But it's like, if you don't zoom a certain way, it doesn't feel like that period. Or if you zoom a way that's modern, it doesn't work. In building that vocabulary and immersing yourself in the films of that time period, like especially the 80s, there's such a variety. You have like the gritty kind of early 80s, like Lucio Fulci, New York Ripper, and then you've got like hardcore George C. Scott in 1979 that obviously there's some, in the lighting and things, there's elements of that. But like, what were some of the, if you were going to say like, this is the MaXXXine film school, like these are some of the movies that really evoke the vocabulary that we wanted to capture that was feeding into our minds subconsciously. Like what were some of those films you were kind of immersing yourself in?
I'm going to kind of like kind of contradict what I just said, because there was sort of 2 very distinct sort of genre elements that we were looking at, and one of them being the giallo films from Italy, the horror films from that period of time. And there actually was very conscious sort of lift out of, like the way the killer is wardrobed and stuff like that is very much like, that's just straight up out of that stuff. And there were times where it was definitely like, oh, let's put like a big purple splash in the background because that would be totally giallo at this moment, So in terms of that, there was a more conscious like, okay, that we can actually like take this kind of thing and put it here, And then the other sort of bucket of like the influences was much more the De Palma movies like Dress to Kill. And like you said, like hardcore and Angel and that kind of vibe of like this sort of LA, for lack of a better word, like B movie from the era kind of thing, like out on the streets a lot kind of, And, but also like, I remember we were looking at stuff from like To Live and Die in LA, the movie with Willem Dafoe in it. And we even looked at some of the early, I'm blanking on his name, the Spanish director, Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, Almodovar, sorry. Yeah, there was some early Motivar stuff that was like, wow, this is weirdly appropriate too. It's hard to say like it was like, oh, other than like the Giallo thing, which was so distinct and particular. Like the other stuff is more like, oh, we're looking at like the beginning of the original Terminator. Like that's straight up the same kind of thing. And you start to get this sort of feel if you look at a lot of these things that are kind of related from the same era. You start to realize like, well, there was ways they did things. There was the equipment they had, the style of the time or whatever kind of led to these sort of shots and sequences and that sort of thing. And I think it's a little bit of a fuzzy thing, like to figure out like exactly how you're doing it. I think to Ty's credit, like he'll make a decision about like how he wants the movie to be, and then he really sticks to it. He doesn't waver. He doesn't kind of second guess himself and say, oh, it might be better if like it was more like soft light here because she'd be prettier or whatever. Like, no, it's like, as he says, if you're going to get wet, you might as well go swimming. And so you just sort of commit and you're like, this is the way it should look. And then you do it.
You mentioned the equipment and stuff. You were shooting Sony Venice 2 for each one. Like it was the same camera. Did you have any thought of switching out the setups that you were doing, or was it just from day one, like this is our workhorse, we're going to kind of roll with this?
The first two were Sony Venice 1 because the 2 wasn't out yet. And then MaXXXine was the 2. And then actually the base lens package for all 3 was the same. It was the Vantage MiniHawks. And then we had a few different lenses, kind of specialty things that we used on the different movies, or the zooms were kind of different on the different movies for different reasons. But for the most part, probably 80% of all 3 movies were shot in essentially the same lens and camera package. From a lighting standpoint, on X, I was trying to be very sort of true to the fixtures and equipment that you would have had, whatever, 1978 or 9 or whatever. And then like I was done with that on Pearl. I was like, I don't want to deal with that anymore. Like Fresnels that go up in the lift and then you can't spot and flood them because they're broken and things going. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff. Both Pearl and MaXXXine, I just used whatever we needed to use to achieve the desired result, really. There was a little talk, I remember at the beginning of the prep for MaXXXine, about maybe looking at some different lens packages. But very quickly we were like, why? Like, these have served us really well. They will do the job on this show also very well. At that point, it was like, let's just go with, the tried and true, what we've been doing and what's been working,
Yeah. Why throw a wrench into this on the third movie? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I had suggested a couple different lens packages, and, Ty was like the whole undertaking of like doing a whole round of testing and like trying to, because at that point it's like, okay, we have to measure something against the MiniHawks and decide if we like it better. And so the amount of work that would have been done to the perceived sort of, I guess the feeling was sort of like, well, even if we found something we'd like better, we'd probably only like it a little bit better. And so the amount of work that we're going to have to go do that would be, that time and energy be much better spent doing other things in prep at this point.
Yeah. Right. One of my favorite shots in the movie is that opening monologue she does for the audition, which is kind of a mirror of Pearl. Mm-hmm. And shot in same thing. It's one take. Here's this moment. The way that scene is lit, you can see her, but her eyes are pretty obscured. That's a risky decision. I feel like sitting down and be like, we're not going to do this perfect lighting on her face for this one shot. Like, how thought through was that scene, that opening shot with her, like in terms of not just lighting her, and it's like we can see every detail. It's perfect. It's this audition shot. Like, obscuring the eyes specifically felt like a very deliberate choice in that moment.
It's like I said, like it's sort of, it's not backing down from like the embrace of what the aesthetic is, and it's not second guessing yourself. It's like, this is the way this shot should look in this movie. It's risky on some level, what but within the context of like, in the project and my relationship with Ty and where we're going with, what had come before and whatever, and what the expectations for this movie were. I would contrast like that shot, say, with at the very end of the movie when she's in her trailer and she's about to be called back in to watch the final shot with her head on the bed and stuff like this. Whereas like that shot where we come off of the flowers that her agent's given her, and we pan around the trailer and we land on her, and it's very much like this sort of like Hollywood glamour shot of her. Everything is about what's appropriate in that moment in the narrative, in the scene, you know what? And so like it would have been really inappropriate in the trailer in the end when she is a movie star to have her look, you know, kind of grungy or whatever, right? Whereas at the beginning of the movie, it is what it is. Like she's walking into this space and being grilled, you know, it's kind of like that thing in Trainspotting when he's sitting down in front of all the people or whatever. Some of it is just kind of subconscious. It's like, I just feel like this should look like this, you know, and the main driver of how any shot should look is the narrative appropriateness of that moment in the scene and in the story, I guess, you know, in the emotional space that people are in and where you want the audience to be, you know. And so considerations like, oh, is she well lit enough or you know, whatever, blah, 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 like kind of can sometimes fall by the wayside, which isn't, you know, doesn't go over great with everybody, but, you know.
Yeah. It's something me and my wife were talking about yesterday, and I won't throw any particular project under the bus, but we were talking about a modern version of an older series that we really enjoy. And I was like trying to put my finger on what was wrong with the new version. Like beyond the writing, I was just like, it doesn't feel the same. And we went back to like an early version of it, and I just said, this world just feels real, like it lived in, like it's not perfectly in focus every moment. Like the new one just feels so clean and hyper perfect, where it just doesn't serve the story at hand. And so it's interesting here you kind of put it that way. And I will say one of my favorite don't say it, show it moments ever in a movie is that last shot where she's cutting the cocaine with her SAG card. It's such a great, and then the $100 bill instead of the $1 bill. I love that moment.
Yeah. I mean, you get the tragic, the trajectory of her life, and yet how it's also staying the same.
Right. Know? Exactly. It's just elevated.
Exactly.
Going into the style and making these decisions, like the most difficult shot to me watching it looks like that tracking shot into the landing strip where you're following, and I don't know if this was the intent. I instantly was like, Goodfellas. Like this is a Scorsese tracking shot in. We're seeing the whole geography of this place. We're getting, you know, we got the little Easter eggs up in the billboards. Like we're seeing this moment of her walking in. How difficult was that in reality? Or was that something that was like deceptively really simple? We've got this location that's perfect for this.
I mean, that was definitely a thing. It was a Steadicam. My A-camera operator, Xavier Thompson, who I met on Snowfall, was our A-camera operator. He did that. You know, Ty had it written in the script, like that it's this one long tracking shot that brings her in through all of these different things. You see all these different sort of aspects of her life and her existence until you get into the dressing room and stuff. And he was in LA before I got down there, because I live up in Portland, and he was scouting, and they found that space. It was like a Masonic lodge or something up in like Chatsworth or someplace like that. And he called me and he FaceTimed me and he's like, hey, we just found this place. It's going to be great. And it was like, it was a bar in the front, but everything else after you left the bar was like not what it was. There was no kitchen. There was no, you know, the space in the back where where it's their porn studio was like this kind of gymnasium kind of thing. But he was like, he just kind of walked it through and he was like, you know, we could do this. We could make this be the kitchen. We could make this be the, you know, the space where the dancers are on the stage and blah, blah, blah. I mean, just architecturally, it worked for laying it out in all those spaces. When it came to actually executing it, you know, it became a bit of a technical undertaking, you know, like coming from the outside. The first thing was, you know, outside to inside that front door is an enormous f-stop pull. And then there's a bunch more that like because you know, it has single channel wireless and I was pulling f-stop through the whole thing. And like when she goes back out the back, it's like stop down and then she comes back in and stop way, you know, bring it way open. And the bigger problem was physically where to be, because like we were using 80 to 90% of the interior of the location and seeing a bunch of the outside too. And, you know, in order to remotely pull, well, both f-stop and for the ACs to pull focus, we had to have a place where we could be that we wouldn't lose signal through the entirety of the shot. So it kind of turned into this whole thing, and we jammed ourselves into kind of this little lobby space that was sort of in the middle of the building, and you kind of hold the receiver up like this to try to get reception at different points and make it work. And then it was kind of just a matter of like, okay, let's plot out what we're going to see at each point in this shot, and let's light it appropriately. Make sure that like the stage is going to look this way. When she walks into the kitchen, it'll have this different kind of color temperature and this different look, and that sort of thing. And then she'll go out and it'll be back into daylight, and then blah blah blah. And so again, it's just sort of like building it through prep like that, like coming to a conclusion like this is what we're going to do, A, B, C, D, E, and then like solve all those little problems along the line until you get it all figured out.
Yeah. This kind of ties into that scene, but also in other places. Cause obviously you've got amazing production design throughout the movie. I mean, all of the movies, but particularly this one, because of the scale, it's so impressive, like how much it looks like the movies of that period. How much of that was just pure production design? And was there a lot of like in post enhancing stuff visually? Like, cause like, for example, in that tracking shot, you've got the plane flying overhead perfectly. I'm sure that's you're not timing that,
Yeah.
And then the shot, just tell me if I'm right about this, because I noticed when she walks out the second time I watched the movie, and I wish I could just stream it and be able to pause all these moments. There's a sign across the street that I believe is the name of the company on the van in X.
Yeah.
Like, visually added later as a joke, or was that something production design put in across the street? Like, I was thinking of all the logistics of that to kind of tie it all together.
Yeah, I think there was a sign there that we needed to cover up, and that was done in VFX in post. And the airplane flying over is a CG plane. I couldn't even tell you. I know Peter, our post-production producer, mentioned in some email or something there was like 300 or 400 VFX shots or something, and most of those are little fixes or little changes or an erase
set extension or something.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't even know, like I don't know what they all are by any means, And Jason Kavsvardi, who is our production designer on this show, and it was Tom Hammock was our production designer on XM Pro, but he wasn't available. And so Ty hired Jason, and Jason did a great job. Jason and his team, like it was an enormous undertaking, but there is always a certain, especially when you're doing period stuff, like there's a decision that has to get made as to like, okay, these foreground elements or these hero things we're going to change physically in the world. And then, a block away, that thing, we'll deal with it later in post or whatever, It's interesting. Like that kind of era of period work, you can get away with a lot of things if they're out of focus, which when I was doing Perry Mason, which is of course in the 30s, like you couldn't, like no matter how out of focus it is, it's not going to read like 1930s LA. But so you kind of have a little more leeway with these things that are maybe, 20, 30, 40 years ago, where like, okay, if that traffic is super out of focus in the background, it's not going to read like modern traffic, But then other things, and it's one of these things that you're looking at it in prep. You're kind of trying to decide like, this is going to be a problem or this isn't going to be a problem. We're going to deal with this or we're not. But then on the day when you're shooting it, you're like, oh man, look at that. Like we didn't realize that was going to be there, or that's new or whatever, and you're like, oh, can we deal with that now? Or like it's a crisis because we've run out of time. So we're going to have to do that later. And then again, when they put it together and in the edit, there's a whole nother go round of like people, looking very closely at all the frames and being like, oh man, that's a weird, modern thing on the wall, a block away that we're going to have to get rid of or whatever.
How much time did you actually have on Hollywood Boulevard itself? Because I'm assuming you weren't allowed to shut that down for 3 weeks and just go crazy. So
no, I think I want to say it was 3 or 4 days and nights. I think we were working mostly splits, like start in the afternoon, end at early in the morning. And I can't remember if it was 3 or 4. And we had like 3 blocks fully blocked off, and then the exterior of like the peep show that she's working at was like another block away that we only had a small section for like one night there. But the hero stuff that's like in front of, that's the alley and in front of her house and the video store and stuff like that, I think we were there, I want to say for maybe it was 3 nights. Yeah. And then of course we were at the Chinese down there for like part of one night, and we didn't even really have that blocked off, and we didn't have, we really only had the that open courtyard area and looking that direction dressed. Looking the other side of the street was all we didn't have any control
So
over
it's
at all.
literally like we're designing this one shot right here, so this has got to look perfect in this frame for
And
that
this,
that
yeah,
final
exactly. And
moment.
then, like when she gets out of the limousine, and it kind of comes up over the limousine, and you're actually looking across that other side of the street, you'll notice it's super out of focus. Like the depth of field is like teeny tiny right on her, and everything's pretty dark back there because we had no control over any of that back there.
And you mentioned the Hollywood sign earlier. That was the other piece I was sitting there going like, is this the real Hollywood sign or did we build this portion? Like, because again, it's one of those things like that's a iconic spot. It's probably very difficult to get permits to shoot in a spot like that, no matter what production it is. Like, how was that set up? And like, obviously, the house at the end is not really located
Mm-mm.
there.
No.
So I was like, there's a little trickery there in terms of like running from a house to the Hollywood sign. So how was that orchestrated? Was it part set? Was it some at the sign? Was it just comping the house and the sign? Like, how did that kind of play out?
Yes, it was a number of things. At first, when I first got down there was this idea that we would shoot at the Hollywood sign, and they had kind of gone through the motions of like figuring out what the restrictions would be and all of this, and there were many. We went out there to scout it, and we went to the actual Hollywood sign and went down the hill, and we were standing there at the base of the Hollywood sign, and it became super apparent really quickly that like this is just not going to work. Like just the restrictions and the reality of the terrain there and everything was just like there's no way. So it took a while, and a bunch of different options were kind of investigated in terms of how and where to do it. And what ended up happening was we went up to one of the film ranches up north. I can't remember the name of the particular one, and they had a hillside that had like this dirt road across it, and they were like, "You can do whatever you want here," So the sign was designed, and it's about I want to say it's between 2/3 and 3/4 of the size of the real sign. So it's a little bit smaller, but big enough that it doesn't read like
It's
cheesy.
smaller.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
smaller. Yeah, we kind of went through and did some loose storyboards. I just did them with this program Previs Pro in order to kind of see what letters we thought we would probably see the most of, so that we could determine how much to build real and then how much would be extension, right? So like the D at the end was maybe half, it might have been part of an O, and then like there was a bunch of letters in the middle that like when you see it in that big wide drone shot, there was just C stands there with lights on them indicating where those letters should be put in, and then like the H and the O at the other end were also like half or 3/4 because that's where so much hero stuff happened, right?
Yeah. Like the hand actually physically touching
Touching it,
the
yeah,
letter, leaving
exactly,
blood on it,
yeah,
that kind of stuff.
yeah. And when Michelle Monaghan comes out with the thing in her eye and falls down, like we're standing with actual pieces of the sign right there. And of course, when she's standing there with the gun and you're looking up and the helicopter light and stuff like this, most of that is real. And then, of course, it was not associated at all with the location of the house. And that house that we shot at, it backs up to another hill that's empty, right? So it wasn't that big of a leap to figure out, like, okay, we can be here, see the house, or crane off the house up to the people running up the stairs, and then lift up, and there was where we would put the sign. It was just basically a hillside and black sky up there. And then conversely, looking the other way where the funicular comes up, that was like looking off into like a much less populated. Again, that place is up like, I don't say Chatsworth again, but it's not. It's somewhere north, way up like that. And it just doesn't, tons of like lights and buildings and stuff were added down there as well.
Gotcha. While I'm thinking about it, because again, I want to just confirm my question about this, but inside the house, which is obviously a totally different location, the green door, is that a direct reference to Behind the Green Door? Because I know obviously Marilyn Chambers is mentioned. Like, there's a lot of like throwbacks. Like, was that an intentional decision? I'm sure that's a
I
Ty
never
question
asked.
too.
I never asked Ty about that, but I assumed it was.
Okay.
Yeah, just because that's the kind of sort of vague or subtle reference that's sort of kind of part of the whole the whole
It
mix.
felt very specific. I was like, well, you don't just choose a green door.
Yeah.
And given the movie, I was
Yeah, and
curious
the
if that was
themes,
kind of
and
the
I
take.
mean, it all kind of links together like that for sure. The downstairs of the house was the real house. When she comes in through the door and starts walking and walks back to the staircase and starts going up the stairs, that was the actual location. And then once she gets to the top of the stairs, it was a set.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of locations, I mean, and we've already hit Hollywood Boulevard, the sign, the house, but then you've got Universal Studios on top of
Oh,
that,
yeah.
which was that.
It was a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing too. I'm running through all the different spots and I'm like, oh, you shot here and you shot here and you did this and this. Universal Studios, in terms of shooting on the actual backlot itself, which it's funny because this movie has so many locations that like versus many movies, a lot of the audience has been to these places. Like there's a lot of people that have been to the Hollywood sign, been to Hollywood Boulevard. People take tours through Universal Studios every single day, over and over and over again.
There were tours going while we were shooting. We would have to stop every now and then.
Was that something where there was a lot of like changes made to the backlot to make it look like the period? Because like I'm a huge fan of any movies that show backlots or behind the scenes stuff. So like the Don Adams, The Nude Bomb, is a horrible movie, but you get a lot of stuff on the Universal backlot. There's like little things that are different. Were there any changes made, or was it kind of like, this is the backlot, it looks like this, let's shoot?
One unique thing that was, because it was both Warner Brothers and Universal, right? Like the big soundstage where she does the audition and where they're filming the Puritan, and when then at the end, that's all on Warner's. And where Lily Collins' trailer is, where they have that little moment outside her door, that was also at Warner Brothers. And there was actually a big long walk and talk that didn't make it in the final film, where Mia and Lily are walking from the big soundstage down to her trailer. That was all at Warner's. And where Liz Debicki picks up Mia to start the golf cart ride, that was at Warner's. And then the rest of it's over at Universal. And because of the impending, everybody was pretty sure there was going to be strikes, production had slowed way down. And at that time, both of those studios, there was virtually nothing else going on, which was kind of a uniquely fortunate situation for us. Because like at Universal, we weren't having to there was still the tram rides and the tours going on, but there weren't any other productions. So when we scheduled it or whatever, we had kind of like the ability to move through the place in a couple of days and shoot what we needed to shoot without having to sort of coordinate with anything else going on. It was unfortunate because it was also a work stoppage for everybody, but it was good for us in the sense that we had kind of the run of the place. And we, there was a lot of discussion about what we could acquire that we could put in the background, like the trailers and some like film equipment and things like that. But I mean, it was kind of a massive amount of space that we were covering. So it was sort of just a judiciously decided, like, we'll put some trailers here. It'll kind of help block that view. We'll do, and when we were up there, like Ty and I spent an afternoon there on a Sunday, just walking through Universal, trying to figure out like how we were going to connect her run, because it's not actually at all connected. And we gave some consideration to like, well, we wouldn't really want to pan over to that because that's all brand new and going to be a problem or whatever. So it was more a matter of like not seeing things that were modern or inappropriate, more so than it was like adding a whole bunch of stuff, Was
that the key reason for splitting between WB and Universal? Was it just because, we need this and they have this and they don't? Or did you just have a certain amount of time at each and made the most of both?
Warner Brothers got used for a lot more than, because also like all that stuff with the protesters and her driving her Mercedes in, and then beginning when she drives out, and when she's having that conversation with Liz about whatever's going on in your life, squash it. When she's on the phone initially calling Labatt, all of that was at Warner Brothers. All of those exteriors that were just meant to be sort of like on the lot, here we are dealing with like her life here. Warner Brothers was just more appropriate because it's like you have more kind of the architecture and the sort of interior, exterior, or like entrance, exit, on and off the lot kind of gates and stuff that just don't kind of exist the same way at Universal. So it's more a consideration of like what would work for what more than anything else, you know.
I know you're obviously a big fan of movies yourself, beyond making them. You enjoy watching them. How cool was it getting to shoot on, say, the Universal Backlot? And then not only that, but also getting to be, I mean, by the Psycho House, you're filming by Bates Motel. Like,
Yeah.
this is one of the most iconic locations ever. So, like, obviously you see it on a tour, but to actually be rolling camera there,
Yeah.
what was that experience like?
In hindsight, I'm like, that's so amazing. You know, when we were actually there doing it, I was more like, this is really weird, you know? And then on top of the fact that I'm like just trying to deal with like shooting a movie. So it gets lost in there somewhere. You're like, you know, dealing with all the problems I always deal with. But it's just an insane and unique opportunity, right? That's not going to happen again. Like, and yeah. I mean, what else can you really say about it? It's like, and in fact, more so than like shooting there, it was the day that like Ty and I were over there scouting, where like literally we could just walk anywhere we wanted. It was just us two.
Like, nobody's kicking us out. What's going on? You know,
there was like no minders and like there wasn't any other production going on. There was just like, stay away from the trams, don't get in the way of the tours, and that was it. And like, just park your car wherever and just walk around. That was truly amazing. I was like, this is crazy. Like,
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's one of those things you can't really like. It's just like, wow,
Yeah, right. I did want to ask this. I know I mentioned that oneer through the landing strip, which is a standout moment. That's like you're watching on screen going, that looks complicated. And this is like our like show off shot. Here we go. Was there anything in the movie that looked like deceptively simple on screen that you're like, this was a pain in the ass to actually shoot? Like,
on some level, I want to say like nothing was easy. But different things like, there, some things pose like weird challenge. Like there's one shot that's kind of this point of view shot that floats down the hallway in the peep show and then turns and goes to the door, that turned into like, it seemed like it should be really easy, but it turned into this whole thing, like how to get it to kind of feel right and go. And I think we first tried it on Steadicam, and then we're rolling the Ronin on a dolly or so. I can't remember, but it like that just weirdly like didn't want to work, and it didn't seem like it should be that hard. When his head gets blown apart, the dad, that we did on stage in a little patch that the art department made, a little patch of dirt to look like the stuff up by the sign. It was just a lock off, like two cameras just, there. And then all the special effects, because it was a practical gag, but we had to do it like 3 or 4 times because just the way the head was exploding was not the way Ty wanted it. So that turned into like kind of a hassle. But just a lot of little things like that, I guess, Boy, now I'm trying to
taking you back through the trenches of like, what was the worst day of your life during this production? It's like, I forgot about those. I blocked all those traumatic.
Yeah, exactly. Those files have been deleted.
Well, you mentioned in our last interview, and it was so interesting listening back to it because it was before I had even seen Pearl. So I had just seen the trailer and was like, it looks like this. Is that what it's going to be? But you mentioned in that there was a lot you shot for Pearl that didn't make the final cut. And
there were quite a few.
I'm curious now, looking back, now that I've seen all 3 of these, and everyone else has that's listening to this, I hope so, because you just heard some spoilers. Like, what were some things that you shot that you wish people could see that maybe were like really incredible or didn't fit the final version of the movies as they exist? That you're like, man, I wish we had those moments.
I remember more of them out of Pearl. Like there was some stuff in the basement in Pearl where she's dancing and she goes over and looks at these jars of canned food, and then they turn into like jars of fetuses and stuff. I thought it was pretty great, and we rigged these little lights underneath them, so when she's looking at them, they like started to glow and stuff. In the end, I think the movie's like, I think Ty made the right decisions about how to put the story together. And so in the era of DVDs, it would be like, oh, and you get the DVDs, and here's all these great, like, what do they call it? Like the extras, where it's like scenes that weren't in the movie and stuff like that. But it's like by the time because it's usually so long after the shoot that I'm like sitting down and looking at like a cut, that like oftentimes I just get involved in like the movie and I'm like, oh, that's great. And then it's like, I'll remember like, oh, wow, we shot that other thing. I didn't see that in there or whatever. It's like, I'm not that attached to it. It's especially if the movie's working well, because that's kind of part of the process, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And I got to ask this too. Does Ti West have a under the table deal with Coca-Cola? Because I was thinking about House of the Devil. You've got the wax paper Coca-Cola cups. You've got the Coca-Cola gas station sign. You've got the new Coke shot, product placement shot in MaXXXine. Is this just something you guys have a little secret handshake deal with Coke that you're getting a good check for?
I have no idea if he does or not. He's never mentioned it to me. I never had noticed that myself. So
it was like watching through a clip from House of the Devil, and I was like, wait a minute, what's with all the Coca-Cola shots? We've got the new
Coca-Cola in House of the Devil too. I don't remember.
Yeah, when they're in the pizza parlor and there's like and I know the prop department slaved over making those wax paper cups, for the time period. And I was like, interesting. Ti West has a little bit of a Coke fascination here.
He's got particular fascinations with things. I would be very surprised if it was like had anything to do with like corporate sponsorship. It's more just his own personal obsession about like a thing, from a time period or whatever.
Yeah, something he saw that just locked itself into his brain.
Yeah, or like something from when he was younger, and he's like, "I was always like this, so it's got to be like this,"
Right. Yeah, that's funny. Okay, I got to ask you this last question here. We've got X. We've got Pearl, an extraordinary origin story. We've got MaXXXine. Is there any other? Are we getting SpaceX? Are we going to take the franchise to outer space in pure slasher fashion, or do you think this is to me, it seems like the bow is on this story and it's done. Do you have any inkling that there's any fourth chapter? And I'm sure you're totally at liberty to say if there is.
I mean, nobody has ever told me, nobody from A24 or Ti has ever told me what to or not to say. I kind of try to be mindful, I guess, or about it. And Ti has talked to me about an idea for a fourth movie, but I don't know how interested he is in doing it or how real it is or if it'll come about or not. He's got other projects that he's like now diving into pretty deeply, I think. And so my sense is it probably is the end, but there is an idea for another movie, I guess, if it's in the cards, I guess. I don't know.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I mean, I really appreciate you taking time to do this again. It's great, and I hope it's not the last conversation. We're 2 in now, so we almost have our own trilogy of interviews. So we've got to bring it all together. Is there anything that you have not been asked about this movie that you're thinking, why has nobody asked me that? I put so much time into this moment, or man, everybody's missing this thing that's like so interesting.
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, it's sort of like, it's not really that nobody's asked it, but it's sort of I guess what seems so successful for me and what's to some degree the most interesting thing to me about doing the whole 3-part project is the way that like I think we successfully explored these sort of themes, these cultural themes from the beginning to the end through these different sort of very different time periods, very different sort of like genre feeling things, and hopefully have made some sort of like relevant cultural statement kind of with the totality of all 3, In my mind, when you get to the end of MaXXXine, it feels to me like kind of when you're in that shot of her in the trailer and, with the SAG card and the cocaine, and then she goes in and there's the moment of silence and then the AD's like this and they got to get going. My feeling is kind of the whole thing is kind of wrapped up there. You know what I mean? Like you suddenly go like, oh, this is what it was all about. Like this is what it was all about for her. This is what it's all about in terms of all three movies. Like just on a thematic level or a like, what did the trilogy end up doing? I think unlike just like three movies that are like, oh, this is a fun movie, and this is a fun movie, this is a fun movie. Like I think there's an actual exploration of like ideas about fame and celebrity and the movie business and our culture and what it all means, that kind of got explored and wrapped up kind of nicely, I think, over the course of the three movies.
Yeah, it speaks to even social media culture and current things without being a corny, like direct
Yeah.
exploration of that specifically. Yeah, it's really cool. Well, I'm glad I asked that because that's an interesting perspective. But yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I'll definitely link people to your socials and things so they can keep up
Oh,
with your work. And I'm excited to see what you do next.
my
Moving
terribly
forward.
abandoned social medias.
So,
Yeah, I
we'll
mean,
see you at the movies.
yeah, exactly. There you go. Well, thanks, Eric.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
anytime. It was a pleasure.